I'm really excited to begin this new sermon series in just a few weeks, walking through some of the parables of Jesus found in the Gospels. There's so much to say about the parables by way of introduction, and so I wanted to share just a few things with you in this format before the series formally begins on September 11th, just so that we can all be on the same page moving forward into the series. Parables are often a confusing and difficult genre for many of us in our reading of the Bible. They can be puzzling and mysterious. They can be confrontational and sometimes harsh or sharp. And so we're going to spend some time in this series walking through and talking about the purpose of the parables, like why Jesus would teach in this way and what his goals are in using this sort of teaching method so often in his ministry. But for now, I just want to highlight a few things for us regarding the parables to help us approach it with good eyes and ears ready to hear what God might have to say to us. So first of all, the parables are primarily concerned with how one hears. So the main question being asked in the parables is, how do you hear? We see this in this really paradigmatic parable that Jesus tells, the parable of the sower. And in this parable, Jesus pictures this farmer, and he's casting seed over all these different kinds of soils. And each soil has this different response to the seed being thrown out. And Jesus uses that parable to ask the question, like, what kind of soil are you? How do you hear this message? And so as we begin this series, the main question that we're going to concern ourselves with is, what kind of hearers are we? We hear the message of Jesus all the time, but how do we respond? The parables will teach us that the only thing that matters in regards to hearing is a hearing that leads to obedient living. So, parables are about how we hear. Second thing is interpreting the parables. That can be a really tricky task. And it's foolish to try and say that there are these really hard and fast rules that apply in interpreting all of the parables, because so many of the parables are very, very different from the next. And so these are just some guidelines to help shape the way we think about interpreting these stories that Jesus tells in the Gospels. So there's 4 of them. Number 1, don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't miss the forest for the trees. In seeking to understand the parables, simple is almost always better than complex. And what I mean by that is to say that before we begin looking at the parable and assigning meaning to every detail in the story, or trying to find hidden layers of meaning in the story, we ought to give time and focus to the simple message that Jesus is communicating by telling the story. So in our study, let's start by seeing what's there in the text for us to see, and let's see it at the face value it's presented to us before we begin to venture down into deeper waters and finding other correspondences and hidden meanings and things of this nature. So don't miss the forest for the trees, number 1. Number 2, we should major in the main characters. Major in the main characters. Most often in the parables, the people in the story provide us with the clearest window into meaning and significance. Now, it doesn't mean that every character in every parable represents something or someone in a one-to-one kind of fashion. It just simply means that often the main characters are the ones providing us with the things we need to know and the lessons we need to learn and where the meaning can be found in a given story. And so we want to spend our time and energy majoring in the main characters in these parables. Third thing, in our interpretation of the parables, we should focus on the kingdom and the king. The kingdom and the king. In Jesus' earthly ministry, he's always teaching about revealing the nature of the kingdom of God. And additionally, in that teaching, he also is teaching about himself as the king of that kingdom, that he is the one who has the power to bring about that kingdom here on earth. And so parables really are not about knowing or understanding something, but instead about embracing and submitting to someone. And so we are wanting to see in our study of the parables the nature of God's kingdom, and we're wanting to embrace and submit to God's king. And then final guideline for interpreting the parables, readers of the parables should live the story. Live the story. I mentioned this a minute ago, but the kind of reading advocated in the parables as virtuous or as wise is reading that leads to obedience. And so our job as readers in these stories is not done when our eyes pass over the text or when our ears hear somebody preach the text. We are to hear and receive the parables in such a way that it would change and shape the way that we live, that we would apply these stories to our lives. And so as we walk through each of these parables, ask yourself the question, how would this parable have me live? Like, what does obedience to Jesus look like? What does life in his kingdom look like in response to this parable? So we've got that primary question, how do you hear? We've got these 4 kind of interpretive principles. And finally, just a couple of quick things on how we're going to approach this series as hearers. 2 quick encouragements for you. Number 1, you should make it a habit to ponder and reflect on the parables. To ponder and reflect. Parables are often said to be sort of in continuity and likeness with the wisdom tradition in the Old Testament, the wisdom literature. And the best way to read the wisdom literature is reflectively, pondering it, considering its implications, reading slowly and repetitively. And so I would encourage you to read and reread these parables, to listen and consider what they might be calling for you to be like or to do, to ponder and reflect on them. The parables are kind of designed like a good tri-tip, right? It's this slow cook, this slow process of letting all of the flavors develop and saturate and emerge. And that only happens through time and through processing, through repetition. And so as we listen to these stories, I would encourage you to ponder them. Reflect on them in places like your home group or your discipleship group. Talk them over with your friends. Let them act as a sort of slow drip of kingdom reality into your everyday life here and now. So encouragement number 1, ponder and reflect on the parables. And number 2, you should place yourself in the world of the parable. Place yourself in the world of the parable. One of the things that sometimes hinders our reading and engagement with the Bible is that the culture of the Bible and the setting of the Bible is often so far removed from us that it can be hard to imagine the sort of tactile and visceral dimensions of the story, of what these stories would feel like. But if we can learn to place ourselves in the world of the parables, we can recover some of that affect in our Bible reading. And so I want to encourage you to consider yourself as someone living in the world of the parable, someone being invited to a new life and a new kingdom, someone being invited to embrace a new king. And as we do that, we will hopefully, by God's grace, be further equipped to respond to these parables the way we ought, in joyful obedience. I'm so deeply looking forward to spending this next season walking through the parables of Jesus with you. We'll see you soon.